4 or 5 weeks ago, we started a new series. We're calling it Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. And we're going to continue that study this morning with a focus on Rahab. Now, we first meet Rahab in the context of the battle for Jericho as Israel was getting ready to enter in the promised land and possess it as God had promised them. And when I think of Rahab, and the reason we're focusing in on her today is she really is a great example of what God can do if we trust him, if we just give him a chance. But the reality is, at the very same time, she is one of the more unlikely heroes that you're going to find in Scripture. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, when we meet her, she's a prostitute. Second of all, and on top of that, she is a Canaanite who, the Canaanites were polytheistic. They worshiped a multitude of gods. And you just wouldn't expect someone like a Rahab, who's a prostitute, who's a polytheistic idolater. You just wouldn't expect someone like Rahab to be a role model. And you certainly wouldn't expect someone like Rahab to play an instrumental role in God's plan. But that's exactly what we find in Rahab. And I really think it is a kind of a testimony or a validation of what our God is like in his grace, in his mercy, in his compassion. When I think of Rahab, I really think there's a real strong comparison between her and Paul. If you remember a couple weeks back, we were talking about Ananias and Barnabas and how they kind of were instrumental in Paul's spiritual journey in becoming the apostle to the Gentiles. And in Paul, he said he was the chiefest of sinners. But because of God's grace, he went from the chief persecutor of the church to the apostle to the Gentiles. And I think that's very similar to Rahab. Here's a Canaanite woman. She's an idolater. She worships many different gods. She's a prostitute. And yet she becomes the hero in the battle of Jericho. Now, one of the things when I think about Rahab is we need to understand that her role came with incredible risk. She's going to deceive her own people, the people of Jericho. And if that deception had been found out, I think it's safe to say it would have cost her her life. So her choice to protect the spies came with incredible risk. At the very same time, it offered great reward. And I think that's what she was counting on. In her mind, the reward that could come about from taking that risk made the risk worth it. And what we're going to do this morning is we're going to kind of dig into her story and kind of flesh it out. And here's what I want you to think about as we're doing this. I want you to think about how important it is to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. Back in the book of Matthew, and we'll look at this specifically when we get toward the end of the message, but back in the book of Matthew, Jesus tells us we cannot serve two masters. We're going to have to make a choice. You cannot serve God and the things of this world. And what we're going to see is Rahab was willing to risk her life to make that choice. She chose God. She chose to serve God. She chose to get on God's side. And it completely changed her life, not just in the immediate, right now moments of her life. It changed her life for all eternity. So let's get started. We're going to start in Joshua chapter 2, and I'm going to read the first 3 verses, and man, that is hard to see. So I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way, which for some reason NIVs on the internet and NIVs in black and white, kind of the old-fashioned, they don't always align, so some of my words might not be those words, but you might not be able to see that any better than I can. Anyway, then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. Now, what we see here is Rahab's life, I believe, could be described. I should probably push the button. Well, maybe not. There we go. Could probably be described as being less than ordinary. And our title is Ordinary People. Saying someone's life is less than ordinary, that's not very nice, is it? And everybody knows I'm a nice guy, right? So why in the world would I say she has a less than ordinary life? Well, when we start tracing her life, the first thing we are told about her is she is a prostitute. Now, I know society has greatly changed. When I was younger and I first became aware, like in the 60s and 70s, of this thing called the feminist movement. Back in the 60s and 70s, you know what the feminist movement stood for? We should not objectify women. Now it's 2025, and the feminist movement is some of the strongest advocates, some of the strongest voices that women should be allowed to be involved in sex work, which makes no sense to me, but that's the reality we live in. So I know that things have changed. Despite that reality, I cannot imagine that this is the kind of life that a young lady would aspire to. You know, we all do that thing when we're kids. Oh, when I grow up, I want to be a policeman. I want to be a fireman. I want to be this. I want to be that. I don't know how many young ladies sit around thinking, I want to be a prostitute. I suspect she had no other options. I suspect this was more an act of desperation that allowed her to survive day in and day out. And I say that because in this culture, at this time, women with a negative reputation in a moral area really were social outcasts. You remember the story of the woman at the well? Some of the uniqueness about that story is the fact that she's meeting Jesus at the well in the middle of the day and there's no one else there. And it's like, well, why is that? It's because she's a social outcast. She would not show up when all the other women came to the well to draw water for their homes for the day because she was an outcast. She had to wait till all of them had gotten their water and left, and then she would show up because of her moral standing. And it didn't matter if you were a Gentile. It didn't matter if you were a Samaritan. It didn't matter if you were a Jew. In that time, in that culture, if you had a negative reputation as far as your morality is concerned, you were looked down upon. And so when I look at Rahab's life, I can't imagine it was an easy life on any level. Now, let's look at the choices that she had. The fact that a couple strange men visited her home as a prostitute normally wouldn't stand out all that much. But as I read this particular text, it seems as if because Israel had been advancing, and it's obvious, and we'll see that in just a second, it's obvious that they were aware of Israel's future intention. It seems like the whole city is on like a heightened awareness. You remember right after 9/11 and we got into the war of terrorism, you would hear this statement, if you see something, say something, right? Seems like that's what's going on in Jericho. And so the king gets word that, hey, a couple Israeli spies have come into our city to check us out, and they were last seen at Rahab's home. So the king sends messengers to Rahab that she is to turn them over. And this is where we see her making her first choice. And again, I'm going to read verses 4 to 7, and I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but he did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may be able to catch up with them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. In these verses, we see her making her first choice. And that choice was made when the spies immediately shows up. Because if you read the text and you just understand what it's saying, it implies that she immediately recognized they were spies. So that one choice is, well, I could turn them over to the king, to the police force, so to speak, and play it safe. She could have just turned them over. Instead, she chooses to hide them. Now, what does that imply? That implies she's pretty sure someone's going to come looking for them. So she's taking a risk right there, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The king finds out, hey, a couple spies are here, and they were seen at Rahab's house, and so he sends messengers, you need to turn them over, and this is where we see her making a second choice. Now, she could easily claim ignorance, turn them over, play it safe. Instead, she takes this risk to protect them, and she lied. And just because I know we struggle with moments like this as Christians, because there is no doubt she lied. And there also is no doubt that lying is sinful. And I wish I could explain this better. This is one of those things in Scripture that I'm perfectly content to let God sort it out. Because the reality is most of the time we lie, and it's an act of self-protection, even when we're lying, and we rationalize it by saying, oh, Tony, I lied to you, but I was actually trying to spare your feelings. No, I was protecting myself. I didn't want to say something uncomfortable to Tony. So I hid behind Tony, I'm trying to protect you. No, I'm protecting myself. Most of the time, I would say always, but usually when you say always and never, you're about to lie. So I'll say most of the time, lying is a self-protection mechanism. I don't think she's protecting herself here. You can make the case, well, yes, she was, because she knew how the story would play out. Yeah, I'm not buying that. I don't think she's protecting herself. I think she's protecting the spies. And so I'm perfectly content to let God deal with this He's perfect. There's a scripture that says he always does the right thing. I don't know about you. I don't always do the right thing. I don't always feel the right way. I don't often think the right thoughts. So I will personally, I'll let God worry about that. She lies. She tells the king's men, well, yeah, the men were here. I didn't know where they were from. I didn't know they were spies. And at dusk, just before the gates were closed, they left. I don't know which way they went. But if you hurry up, you may be able to catch them. And the king's men have no reason to assume Rahab is lying, so they head off in hot pursuit, trying to track down the spies. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to kind of pause right here, and I want to ask this question. Why in the world would she take that kind of risk? She's living in a city that, if you are familiar with the Old Testament story of the Exodus and the entry into the Promised Land, the first time Israel had gotten to the border of the Promised Land, they sent 12 spies into the land. 10 of them came back and said, it's everything God said it was, but we better not go in. Why? Man, they've got big walled cities. And they've got big, old, impressive armies. And there's giants in there. And if we go in there, they're going to squash us like grapes. Now, they were telling the truth. That's what they had observed. They were not factoring in the greatness of God to make that report. Only Caleb and Joshua said, let's go in. God gave it to us. It's a piece of cake. All the other spies were looking at it through more of a humanistic, earthly lens. That is crazy talk. Now, Rahab is living in a city with impressive walls that at that time were basically impenetrable, that the only way you conquered cities like that was to siege them. And basically that requires you camp out and wait till they run out of food and die of starvation, and then you take advantage. And if Israel took that posture, all the other Canaanite armies could get rounded up and attack them. They would be in a vulnerable position. And that's kind of common sense. That's why you live in a walled city. It's a very safe and secure position. So why would she take that kind of risk? She was, as far as I could see from a humanistic perspective, she was sitting in a pretty secure position. So let's think about what she was thinking. And we kind of get insights starting in verse number 8. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and she said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard of how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. We heard what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. And when we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Here we get kind of insight into what she's thinking. If the question is, why do you take such a risk? The answer is, I know the Lord has given you guys the promised land. Now, how does she know that? They heard about the Red Sea being dried up. Now, isn't it reasonable to assume if you've heard about the Red Sea, what else have you heard about? Things like the plagues, right? And then they heard about the defeat of the Amorite kings Sihon and Og, who apparently were pretty impressive fellows that Israel had taken care of. So that when the people of Jericho began to hear whispers that Israel was coming, and you better watch out because this is what Israel has done. They crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. They defeated these Amorite kings. Their God is an impressive God that poured out plagues on Egypt, the most powerful nation on earth at that time. And Rahab, in describing what was taking place in Jericho, said our hearts melted in fear, and any courage we had completely vanished as far as she was concerned. And I don't think we can measure fully what this actually means. But she said, as far as I'm concerned, your God is a God in heaven and in earth. Now remember, the Canaanites believed in a multiplicity of gods. They were polytheistic. And we talked about it before. Adding another god to your list of gods is no big deal if you're already polytheistic. So I would not take this to say, oh, well, she's a born-again Christian at this point in time. She's a believer for sure at this time. But she's certainly growing in her understanding of who the God of Israel is and what that God is capable of. And she's beginning to see him as being superior to any gods that she's familiar with as a Canaanite woman. And so we may not know exactly what she understands at this point in time. What we do see, and remember what Jesus says about faith. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, right? You can say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, and it shall be done for you. And we see this woman with, I don't think she has 100% complete understanding, but she has enough faith to risk her life to get on God's side in this particular situation. And she has a reason for doing this. And so let's talk about her future. And it's kind of described for us here in verses 12 to 14. Now then, this is Rahab speaking, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death, our lives for your lives. The men assured her, if you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. What is she thinking? Well, she's hoping that if I protect you at incredible risk to my own life, if I protect you, I want you to protect me. When the battle for Jericho begins and the war is waging, I want you to spare my life and my family's life. And the spies agreed, as long as Rahab is willing to keep their secret. She and her family will be spared. And here's what I find interesting. So we have this ordinary woman, as I mentioned, maybe a less than ordinary woman, willing to trust God and the people of God with the hope that he would simply spare their lives when the battle started. Is she expecting anything extraordinary? No. Just spare my life. That's all I'm looking for. Just spare my life. And here's what I find so awesome about God. In Ephesians, it says, he is the one who's able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond anything we could ask or think. So she's looking for survival. God delivers way more than survival. And so let's take a look at the rest of her life. And basically, Rahab becomes the hero in this particular story. And we see that recorded in verses 15 down to 24. So she let the spies down by a rope through the window, for her house was a part of the city wall. Now she had said to them, "Go to the hills, so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." The men said to her, "This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If anyone goes outside your house, into the streets, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed. And she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills. They stayed there 3 days until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." First thing we learn is that Rahab helps the spies escape. There we go. She helps the spies escape. Her house was actually built in such a way that one of her walls was a part of the city wall. She has a window in her home. And so she lets them down with a rope and tells them, "You go up in the hills, hide 3 days. Eventually, they're going to call off the search. And after 3 days, you'll be safe. You can go about your business." And that's exactly how it played out. Spies escape. They hide in the hills for 3 days. They eventually make their way back to Joshua, and they tell him all of their findings from their spy mission. And I assume he tells them about the deal they had made with Rahab. Now, all of that is in Joshua chapter 2. The battle for Jericho starts in Joshua chapter 6. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in between, so I'm going to catch you up to speed. First thing that happens is right now they're in the Transjordan, meaning they're on the east side of the Jordan River, and the Promised Land is on the west side of the Jordan River. So they have to cross the Jordan, and that in and of itself was a miracle because it was flood stage, which tells us it's probably in the spring with the snow melt. So the river's at flood stage, and the Bible tells us as soon as the priests who were leading the procession to cross the river, as soon as they put their feet in the water, the Jordan River began to back up, and they crossed the Jordan on dry ground. When they get into the Promised Land, they circumcise all the men, because during the wilderness wanderings, when the previous generation that failed to go in the first time, when that generation was dying out and a new generation was being risen up, none of them had been circumcised. And so, cross the Jordan, all the men are circumcised. They're given time to heal. They celebrate the Passover now in the Promised Land. What I think is really cool, and it's just kind of a little note in the text if you read it. Right after the Passover, they eat from the produce of the Promised Land for the very first time. And the manna stops. You don't need manna anymore. I said I would give you the promised land. I gave you manna until you get to the promised land. You now have the promised land. No more manna. I think they were happy about that. They were probably tired of manna by this time. And then they get ready to attack Jericho. And we've talked about the battle for Jericho many times in the past. It is one of the more unusual strategies you will ever find in a war campaign. But I think this strategy had a purpose. Remember, if we go back to the Exodus, when they're down in Egypt, and God is calling Moses to go down there and deliver his people. Moses actually says to God, well, when I go back, they're going to say, who sent me? What do I tell them? And we know the encounter at the burning on the bush, I am that I am, and he gave him his name to explain to Israel who sent me. Israel, during the 400 plus years they were in bondage in Egypt, had lost touch with their God. And they needed to be reconnected. They needed to get back to that understanding of who God is and what he is capable of. And the plagues play a role with that. And the Red Sea plays a role in that. And all of the miracles in the wilderness play a role with that. But they are still growing. They are still learning. They are a work in progress. And so the reason this campaign is so unusual is it's another opportunity for God to demonstrate that it's not by power and not by might, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. It's another opportunity for their faith to grow. And so the strategy to defeat this awesome walled city is the first 6 days of the battle, we will have a parade. We will march around the city once a day for 6 days. On the seventh day, we will march around the city 7 times. And then all the priests will blow a trumpet, and all the people will shout, and the walls will collapse. And if I was the general, I'd be like, man, what are you smoking? It's like, dude, let's come up with a plan B, because I don't think plan A is going to work. But the reality is, that's exactly what happened. Now, let me read from Joshua 6 now, where the battle for Jericho is playing out. Starting in verse 22. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her. So the young man who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. Now notice, when they first bring her out, they put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Notice the difference. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now, why do I bring that up? Rahab was hoping for survival. God is the one who does exceedingly abundantly beyond anything we could ask or think. And I see Rahab as a great example of that, because she's looking for survival, and God is thinking transformation. When we first met her, she was a prostitute in a Canaanite city that worshiped idols. She takes this incredible risk risking her own life to trust God and protect the people of God, the spies, so that her life is spared. But I see way more than survival in this particular account. That last phrase, she lives among the Israelites to this day. She's living as an accepted member of the Jewish community where she's experiencing a completely different life. Let's look at the book of Matthew. No, boy, I'm not going to turn to that one. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. And Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. And Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Notice, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And if we kept reading in the book of Matthew, we would eventually get to the fact of Jesus being in this family tree. Now here's what I'm thinking. Normally genealogies are not that exciting. When I get to the genealogies like in Leviticus and passages like this, I usually kind of fast forward. Yeah, I read that. Not really. Because they're not all that interesting, but this one really is an exception. Rahab was the wife of Salmon, who gave birth to Boaz. Now, we're familiar with Boaz from the story of Ruth. Boaz was a wealthy, well-known, respected member of the community. Ruth was a Moabitess who had married an Israelite who had died. So she's a Moabite widow. And Boaz married her. Why? What did he see in this woman? Well, he saw someone who had basically surrendered her life to care for her mother-in-law, and in doing so had earned a tremendous kind of reputation within that community, so much so that Boaz, this wealthy, well-known kind of pillar of the community, was willing to marry her. I suspect there may have been another reason. His dad did something very similar. If Boaz is a well-known, well-respected, wealthy kind of pillar of the community, it's somewhat fair to say Salmon, his father, that would be true of him as well, because wealth would be passed on from generation to generation. Completely different, life experience. You were either born in the wealth or you were born in the poverty. So Boaz is born in the wealth. Whose wealth? Salmon's wealth. So Salmon is a well-known, respected pillar of the community, that sort of thing. He's willing to marry a Rahab. On what terms? Would someone like Salmon marry a Rahab who still has questionable morals? I don't think so. That would kind of be out of left field, right? But would he be willing to marry a Rahab who was the hero in the Battle of Jericho, whose life had been transformed by God's grace? Well, yeah, I think he'd be willing to do that. Just like I think his son was willing to do that when he saw that same character in Ruth. And it appears that's exactly what happened. With the result that she ends up in David and in Jesus' family tree. It's an awesome example of God's grace. And as such, she is really a role model of faith. Look at a couple scriptures. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Hebrews 11 is often referred to as the Faith Hall of Fame for Old Testament heroes. Who goes into the Hall of Fame? Exceptional. It's not called the Hall of Mediocre. It's not called the Hall of Pretty Good. It's the Hall of Fame. You had to demonstrate an exceptional level of prowess in your given sport, whether it's basketball or baseball or football. You have to be one of the top players. So the fact that she is recorded in Hebrews chapter 11 says she ranks right up there from God's perspective, because he's the one that inspired the writing of Hebrews 11. From God's perspective, he's saying, you know what? Rahab's faith is equal to Abraham's faith. Think of some of the incredible things Abraham did. He leaves his country, he leaves his family, follow God, not knowing where he's going. And later in life, when God says, I want you to take your son Isaac up on Mount Moriah and offer him to me as a sacrifice, Abraham is willing to do it. And God is saying, you see that faith of Abraham? Rahab's faith is right there with him. Now look at the book of James. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? Now we have to be very careful with passages like this. In the book of James, in chapter 2, he's dealing with the issue of faith in relationship with works. And the point he's making is, if you claim to have faith, but there's no demonstration of that faith in action, he says, what good is that kind of faith? Faith without works is dead. In other words, true faith produces righteous behavior. And that's exactly what we see in Rahab. Her faith produced righteous behavior. Her behavior was rooted in that faith and sprung from that faith. Her works did not give her a standing of righteousness. Her faith did that, but her faith produced the righteous works. It demonstrated her faith. Same way Abraham believed God, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. Well, how do we know Abraham believed God? Because he left his family, and he left his homeland, and he followed God to the land that God directed him to. Because of his faith, he followed God. Because of Rahab's faith, she protected the spies. Now, let me try to wrap this up for today. When we come to Joshua, kind of the underlying message of Joshua is God has big plans for Israel. He has been waiting 40 years to give them the promised land. And here's the thing about God. God could give them the promised land any old way he wanted to. He's God. He's allowed to do that kind of stuff, right? But what we often see in God's plans is that he often uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. That's why we're doing this particular study. And even more so, when we look at examples like this, we should be encouraged because it demonstrates, look at what God can do in my life, in your life, if you just give him the chance. Now, I doubt that any of us, I know I haven't, I doubt that any of us have ever faced the critical choice like Rahab. I've faced critical choices, none of which did I ever think, oh man, if you make the wrong choice, you might die. You know, I might lose a job, that sort of thing, if I make the wrong choice. I might lose out on a good investment, or I might end up with a really bad investment, right? Critical choices. Never one where, okay, if you're on the wrong side this time, you're dead. So I doubt any of us ever were in this kind of position. But here's what I do know. We make choices every single day of our lives. Some more important than others. Here's what I want you to think about when you start evaluating the various options and choices you make on a daily basis. Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. Instead, store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break through and steal. Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all those other things that God knows that you have need of, they will be given to you as well. Jesus calls us to live with an eye on eternity, with a future perspective. Lay up treasures in heaven. And I would suggest to you that is exactly what Rahab did. And as a result, her life starting right then and there changed for the rest of her earthly life. And then her whole future life changed as well. And the good news is God hasn't changed. And when we are willing to trust him, when we are willing to take that futuristic perspective and look at life through the lens of, I want to lay up treasures in heaven, he can do the same thing for us that we see exhibited in the life of Rahab. So if we follow her example, the reality is, just like her life was never the same, our life will never be the same. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this example. And I pray it would sink in, because it is such a great example of what you can do. You can take a Paul, who is a persecutor of the church, and turn him into an apostle to the Gentiles. You can take a Canaanite prostitute and turn her into a woman who ends up in David and Jesus's family tree. You are the one who's able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond all we could ever ask or think. But it requires us to make the right kind of choices in our lives. And Rahab chose to lay up for herself treasures in heaven. And I pray that every single day, as we make the choices that we make on a daily basis, we would see how important it is to lay up treasures in heaven, and that would be exactly how we live. Because I know when we live that way, not only does our right now get better, our eternity does it well. May it be so. To the praise of your glory, I ask it. Amen.